Breaking Away isn't about Brexit, or Arctic ice, or Antarctic ice, or damaging a scale, or a Scottish man who's paralyzed after an accident on an oil rig. It's about cycling, biking. Well, really, it's about a lot more than that, but things are wrapped up into the package of an understated 1970s sports movie. What more could you want? Well, personally, I hate bicycles. It's a long story, but I love this movie, and in the name of preserving long form content, and in the name of stretching out everyone's attention span, which frankly I feel is my civic duty, I'll tell you why this is a great movie. Breaking Away is directed by Peter Yates. This is the only one of his movies that I've seen. Bullet, I guess, is his most famous. I've thought about watching The Dresser in the past. If you've seen it, let me know if it's any good, because I've really been on the fence about it. Breaking Away stars Dennis Quaid and Dennis Christopher, and at first it might seem like the movie is going to be all about Dennis Quaid or his character Mike. Mike is this kind of James Dean-esque ex-quarterback. It turns out that the movie kind of snakes around and focuses more on Dennis Christopher, or his character, Dave Stoller. It's kind of focused on the friend in some ways. Mike and Dave, along with two other friends, are facing their first summer after high school. They're 19 years old, I guess. And the future for them is wide open. Unfortunately, they live in Indiana, so this seems to generate ennui more than anything else. The movie is set in Bloomington, Indiana, and it's inseparable from its location. To be fair, I'm not sure I could tell the difference between Bloomington, Indiana and Bloomington, Illinois, but location is a really important part of this movie. Of course, it was filmed on location, and even if you've never been there, it seems legit. It seems like the place, you know? Let's get to the bikes, though. Let's get to what everybody came here for, the cycling. Dave is really into biking, and by extension, he's really into the Italian cycling program. He's totally consumed by it. His father hates this. There's some anti-Italian sentiment in the film from his father. What's the opposite of a bike? Well, a car. And Dave's father is a used car salesman. Okay, maybe you think it's an upside-down bike or a backward, inside-out bike, but for our purposes, I'll say it's a car. The father is played by Paul Dooley, kind of an Eli Wallach or Maury Amsterdam type. So this is, in some ways, a comedic role, but there's also a lot of tension between Dave and his father that drives some of the movie and that speaks to some of the deeper ideas of generational change. This movie has something in common with last week's movie, which is that it features someone who was in Barney Miller. This time, it's Barbara Barry, who in truth barely appears in Barney Miller, even though she had a starring role. I never was really understood why that was. Anyway, here she plays Dave's mom, and she's one of the highlights of the movie, one of many endearing and really strong characters. I think she was nominated for an Academy Award for this movie. This movie won an Academy Award for its screenplay, written by Steve Tessick, and it was nominated for a few others. One other aspect of the movie, an important one, is that Bloomington is home to IU, Indiana University, and there's a certain rivalry between the students there and the good people of Bloomington. You can probably imagine what this is like, the townies and the students. We'll come back through some of the more substantial themes in a moment. The first thing that struck me about the movie, actually, is just how nice it is as a historical document. For some reason, I kept thinking, wow, this is an impressive historical film. Of course, it's not quite a historical film. It was set more or less in the present day. But there is something a little bit nostalgic about it. There's something kind of backwards looking, I think. And there are a lot of naturalistic details, as if the film was intended, to some extent, to be a time capsule. Maybe that wasn't the idea, but there's a lot of stuff that sneaks in that caught my eye, like the old school bike helmets. Of course, all the bikes are old, but the bike helmets you really notice. For the most part, people don't wear bike helmets, but when they come on in one scene, you think, oh yeah. Everybody's dressed a certain way. Their swimming attire is particularly notable, very of a time. There's a couple of larger set pieces in the movie, and I thought, wow, this is an astounding recreation of the 1970s. How did they do this? Of course, they just went outside because it was the 1970s. My confusion aside, this movie does really capture the time, and I think it does better than the average movie that just happens to be set during a particular time. For some reason, this really seems to get the lightning in a bottle. I have some theories I'll come back to a bit later on. I've sort of been talking in terms of style, but this is also true about a lot of the ideas in the movie, which again, we'll get back to. I love the color in this movie, by the way. When we're talking about style, we can talk about the color. I don't know if you've seen those memes about Mexico in movies. Everything's tinted like yellowish, or Poland in movies. Here, we've got Indiana in a movie, I guess, and we've got the 1970s in a movie. It's a very particular look. And overall, I actually wouldn't say that this movie is super notable in terms of its cinematography or its production at all exactly, but the look is distinct and endearing, I think. The tone of Breaking Away is interesting. I mentioned already that the father is sort of a comedic character, and this is partially a comedy film. It's partially a sports movie. There's a romantic angle to it. There's a big rivalry. There's the small town thing. It's this sort of semi-effacing Americana thing as well. And of course, it's from the 1970s and is fairly understated. So there's a lot of different things happening here, and it actually might be a little bit hard to pull out the different threads at first. There were a few jokes earlier on that didn't quite register with me. I didn't quite realize they were jokes exactly. Oh, wait, is this a comedy? But once you get into the movie and you sort of pick up on the characters, pick up on the sense of humor, I think the balance is really nice and, again, really endearing. There's a lot more to the tone than just a couple of jokes, though. I mentioned already that this is a nostalgic film. It reminds me a bit of something like Stand By Me. It's about much older kids, of course. It also reminds me a little bit of Deliverance, although I'm not sure why exactly. Dave's love for the Italian cycling team, his love for these guys, is kind of goofy, kind of naive, kind of over the top, but it's sweet. And it feels like childhood. Your parents say, oh yeah, he went through the phase where he would only say the word trampoline, right? It's one of these phases, right? This movie captures something youthful. Yeah, they're 19-year-olds, but they kind of seem younger than that. And that might be one of the reasons why the movie seems so nostalgic. One of the places it gets its spark is showing kind of the youthfulness of these teens. Most movies about 19-year-olds, or really any teenagers, are pushing them towards adulthood, right? They're driving around. Of course, they do plenty of cruising in this movie. But they're doing all these adult things. They're really pushing into adulthood. This movie shows the other side, gives us a lot of time of just seeing these kids hanging around. The beginning of the movie, for instance, doesn't really pick up very quickly. They're just kind of hanging out at first at a quarry. It's deliberate pacing. Modern viewers might find it boring. It's not too slow, but it's a little deliberate. But like I said, it's just giving you room to see these kids just kind of playing around, right? Teens, but playing around in kind of this endearing and sort of childish way, in a sense. Okay. So yeah, the movie has tons of jokes, and it's got all these joys of childhood. So it must be this really happy movie, right? Well, not exactly. It also has a deep sense of Midwestern ennui, a deep sense of generational strife, disenfranchisement, uncertainty. Where are they going with their lives, right? One reason why they're maybe not feeling pushed into adulthood is because it seems like a total dead end, like there's nothing there. Where do we go from here? I'm 19, is this the end? Well, okay, it's been a good life. Now we just sit around working at the AM, PM? On top of all this, of course, we have the sports stuff, the actual cycling. In some ways, the biking really isn't the biggest thing in the movie, and in some ways, I wouldn't even call this a sports movie, but the end of the film does have a big dose of racing, so if you hang around for that, you'll get something suspenseful and fun to watch. One final thing to mention about the tone is something that the movie doesn't do, which I think is fortunate. I've talked already about the small town rivalry, about kind of the romance. Oh yeah, there's a romantic angle in this too. I don't know if I mentioned it. The college kids and the townies, right? This might start to sound like West Side Story or something like that. This movie does have a bit of an Americana feel to it, although it's kind of subverted. Kind of has a rebel without a cause thing going a little bit, but it pulls back in all the right places, and it avoids being too on the nose, I think. I mentioned already that the movie isn't really about the big guy, for instance, right? It's not really about the James Dean character. It's more about the friend. I won't mention some of the other stuff because it would spoil the movie, but if you look at the ways that the climax is kind of structured, if you look towards the end of the movie, in particular, you look at which characters are actually there and which ones, notably, have sort of left the story at that point, pretty telling how they pull back from kind of the traditional high school film or whatever, right? From being Romeo and Juliet, Overall, I think this movie keeps things pretty subtle and has a relatively light touch. One final thing about the tone is that there's kind of a big shift in the tone of the movie around halfway through, I guess. Again, I won't put any spoilers here, but if you think the movie is too frivolous at first, which it isn't really, but if you're leaning on that side, the second half is a little bit more sober and a bit more serious, I guess. Okay, besides the basics of the plot, there are two underlying conflicts in the movie that really push things along. First, generational tension, right? I mentioned that Dave and his dad sort of embodied this, but it's much broader than them as well. All of Dave's friends feel this. And yeah, seems like runs throughout society. There's also the tension between the university students and the locals, which seems to allude to broader questions about class, about the changing economy. Really, this is linked to the first thing. This movie doesn't overplay either of these subjects, but they're there throughout. For the first thing, I think most people have a sense of the cultural upheaval of the 60s and 70s. They've heard of something about that, right? This movie is actually somewhat late on the scene, given that it came out in 1979, and in some ways, it almost doesn't feel like something to file under the counter culture. 1979, but it's set in a place that isn't the most progressive, maybe in a place that is a little behind the times in terms of at least being on the cultural vanguard. I've got nothing against Indiana otherwise, despite my consistent Midwest slander in this movie. If you're coming to the video because you live in Bloomington, sorry about that. Anyway, there isn't a lot of overt political stuff in this movie, to be honest. Talking about the counterculture, whatever, talking about it being a 60s movie. Well, they're not protesting the war left, right, and center here. Well, there's various reasons for that, but there's not really any overt political stuff going on at all, right? Dave isn't disappointing his father by going to protests, but by riding a bike, which might seem quite different, but in some ways I think it's actually a really nice stand-in. Biking, and I'm not an expert on the whole history of bikes exactly, but biking in the 1970s does seem to have been part of a cultural upheaval to some extent. And this thing, the comparison between the biking and the driving actually is, I think, kind of profound in some ways. It's worth noting that, of course, Mike cruises around in his car as well, so they also drive. But anyway, in the film, the townies are called cutters by the students. The term alludes to the quarry that once drove Bloomington's economy. In real life, I guess the term was stoners or stonies, but they changed it to cutters for the movie Hollywood at it again. The film begins in the quarry, actually, but it's full of water. It's long been decommissioned, and now Mike and Dave and the boys go swimming there. The film gives a fairly empathetic view of this economic upheaval, right? So there's a cultural upheaval, there's a new generation, but there's also a sense of economic disenfranchisement affecting an older generation, and these things are tied together. Dave's dad has a really, really great monologue later on in the film about this, where he talks about, the legacy of manufacturing, building things in Bloomington. And at one point, he goes to a factory. He hangs out with all the old friends. I guess he worked, before he was a used car salesman, he worked at a mill or something like that. And he goes back to the mill. And it's funny to see how fluent he is in this culture, this machinery, all this stuff. Anyway, today, in 2024, it seems like people are still talking about the death of American industries. Maybe because it's still happening, or maybe because people still haven't gotten over it. There's a great moment in this movie where one of Dave's friends is supposed to get a job. He shows up for his first day and goes and talks to the manager, who kind of condescendingly gives him all these instructions, tells him what to do, and the last thing he says is, "Don't forget to punch the clock." Well, Dave's friend walks over to it, punches it with his fist, breaks it, walks off. We are, again, today, at a time where many people feel like they don't have a place in the economy, or feel like it doesn't make sense to participate. Of course, Dave's dad has a lot of opinions about what it means to work. Gotta come home exhausted and such. These conversations sound kind of like what you might hear today, like, oh, there's no good jobs out there, and, well, younger people saying there's no good jobs out there, older people saying younger people don't want to work. It might sound like I'm about to say that in some ways the movie still feels relevant, or, oh, these themes are really timeless, or something like that. Maybe the themes are poignant or whatever, but I actually don't think the movie feels that relevant today, even if some of the ideas are kind of poignant. There is a much stronger feeling of a different time to me, right? This movie, more than anything, feels, like I said, like a time capsule. And maybe relevance would not be the first term that I think of. This is, for instance, a strikingly pre-internet story, right? Dave is obsessed with the Italian cyclists from afar, right? That's a totally different dynamic from today. It's interesting to compare his type of fandom with what people might do today, but I think it's very different in some crucial ways. People in general in this movie feel like they're living in a pretty small world. Like they don't have a view of the wider world except through hearsay and conjecture. Well, those are types of evidence. There is a certain smallness to everything. Okay, the second big thing in this movie is the relationship between the town and the school. There are some interesting pieces here. Some of it is kind of what you'd expect with this rivalry, but there's a couple things that are kind of interesting. One is that I was sort of surprised, actually, at the end of the movie to see a message of thanks for IU. Now, it shouldn't be too surprising because obviously they filmed a bunch of the movie on the campus and they had a bunch of students as extras, so it makes sense that they would thank them. But for the most part, the college students in this movie are the bad guys. They're stuck up at best, right? So maybe a little surprising that IU would help out with this movie that doesn't paint them in a great light in some ways. It turns out that the film was written by an alum of IU who actually rode in the Little 500 as an alternate. That's the real bike race that this movie is kind of centered around. Dave Stoller was inspired by one of this guy's friends who was a really strong rider. One thing that sticks out like a sore thumb here, though, is that these people were both students at IU, and they were both riding for a fraternity. In other words, they were the baddies. I guess this film was actually an amalgamation of two of Tessick's screenplays, which kind of explains how this happens. He had one that was about the Cutters, and he had one about the Little 500, and they got combined, right, to make this movie. Still, that's sort of an interesting reversal. The fact that it could be inspired by people who were students at the school when the whole essence of the movie is that it comes from the other side of things. And that is really one of the virtues of the film. This is a extremely working class movie, which is pretty cool. And it's an interesting perspective to see the people, the college students as the bad guys. That is not the case in most movies, I think, and throughout much of American culture. The college path is sort of the righteous one, although maybe people's views on higher education are slipping. I don't know. Okay, another interesting dynamic here is that when a lot of people think about the upheaval of the 60s and 70s, they probably think of college campuses, right? That's where all the groovy stuff is happening. Well, here, the students are kind of conservative. I don't mean that in a political sense necessarily, because again, politics don't really come into the picture in this movie, but they aren't the groovy 60s hippies that you might expect to find on a college campus everywhere. And this is something that I actually really like about the movie. For people who weren't actually around in the 60s and 70s, I think the era can seem monolithic, like it's a bunch of hippies, essentially. Obviously, things were way more complicated, but it's not easy to get the full picture if you weren't there to understand all these different cultural sort of areas, niches, all these different people, what they were interested in, right? I really like how this movie shows disenchantment that isn't explicitly political, really, right? It gives us a view of people, of 1960s upheaval that really is nowhere near Haight-Ashbury, that doesn't really involve consuming drugs, doesn't really mention the war, but there's still a sense of upheaval and disenchantment. That's interesting. And it's interesting that the institution, this university, plays into this as being an arm of the establishment, essentially. And not just the university, but many of the students there. Okay. I don't have a lot more to say about this movie, but I like it. In general, I think it's extremely endearing. The characters are endearing, but there's also some real turmoil. It's naturalistic, with some scenes that honestly are tough to watch, which is A+ for me. And yeah, like I said, it captures a time and a place, but that's putting it mildly. Most movies do that. There's something incisive in this film, both about the phase of life, this transition to adulthood, but also about this time and this place, Indiana, in 1979, I guess. And like I said, shedding a pretty interesting light, adding another facet, another angle on sort of this cultural upheaval that is quite nuanced, that gives a lot of room for Dave's father gives you an understanding of why Dave's generation is feeling like they need something else, or like it's not the way, or why they feel disenchanted, even though it's never really spoken about directly. You get such a sense of why maybe they want to go someplace else. So that's Breaking Away. Let's face it, it's the greatest thing to ever come out of Indiana. I'm just kidding. I have been to Indiana, for your information, and I found it to be okay. Anyway, next week, we're going to be doing another movie about biking, most likely. So if you like bicycles, come back for that one.